Your house is bleeding heat, and the reason isn't your windows. It isn't your insulation. It isn't your furnace. The reason is outside, 22 feet from your foundation, where a line of trees is supposed to be standing and isn't. That line, planted at exactly 22 feet, grown to exactly 2.5 times the height of your roof, angled to block the northwest wind, cuts winter heat loss by 47%. 47. The Amish have been planting it for 287 years. Every farmhouse, every barn, same pattern, same distance, same math. Their houses stay warm when the heat shuts off. Yours turns to ice in an hour. And the reason you don't have those trees, the reason no one ever told you to plant them, is because in 1981, the federal program that taught Americans how to do it was shut down by a budget cut. And the oil and gas industry spent the next 40 years making sure it stayed forgotten. 22. Remember this number. You'll need it. 22 feet from the foundation to the tree line. Not 15, not 30, 22. Because that distance is where the math works. Where wind hits the trees, curves upward, and passes over your roof 30 feet in the air without ever touching the walls. The trees don't block the wind. They redirect it, and in doing so, they create a pocket of still air around the house. A dead zone where heat doesn't get ripped away by 30-mile-per-hour gusts that turn a 70-degree house into a 60-degree house in 20 minutes. The Amish didn't learn this from a manual. They brought it from Europe in the 1730s, from Switzerland and Germany, where farmers had been planting windbreaks for centuries, and they've been doing it the same way ever since, because it works, and because a house that holds heat is a house that doesn't burn through firewood or oil or gas just to stay livable. There's a formula carved into a notebook that's sitting in an archive at the University of Wisconsin, undigitized, uncatalogued, written in pencil by a man almost no one remembers. The page shows a simple drawing, a house, a row of trees, and a curved arrow showing wind flowing up and over. At the top of the page, in small, careful handwriting, it says, H times 2.5 equals optimum. Height of the house times 2.5 equals the height the trees need to reach to create the windbreak effect. Raphael Zon, born in Belarus in 1874, immigrated to America in 1907, became a forest engineer for the United States Forest Service, and in 1934, convinced President Franklin Roosevelt to fund the largest tree planting project in American history, 220 million trees. A shelter belt stretching from North Dakota to Texas, 1,800 miles, designed to stop the wind that was turning the Great Plains into a dust bowl and blowing topsoil all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Zon didn't invent the windbreak. He imported it, formalized it, and scaled it. And the formula he used, the one sitting in that notebook, is the same formula the Amish were already using, because the Amish had brought it from the same part of Europe Zon came from, and they'd never stopped building with it. But here's the part almost no one knows. Zon's formula was never officially published. The Shelterbelt Project planted the trees, measured the results, documented the energy savings, and then filed the research in an archive and moved on. The program ran from 1934 to 1942, and by the time it ended, 220 million trees were standing. But the manual that explained how to plant them, the USDA Windbreak Manual, was published in 1942 and never updated. The last edition, printed in 1962, is the final record of the program, and after that, nothing. There was no new research, no updated guidelines, no mention in modern agricultural extension publications, and then the knowledge just stopped. Now let me show you what happened, because this isn't a story about trees. It's a story about what happens when a solution that works gets erased because it competes with an industry that profits from the problem. But first, let me take you somewhere most people have never seen, deep into Belarus, into the Polisia region, where the land is flat, wet, forested, and brutally cold in winter. The traditional farmhouses there, the ones that survived 2 world wars and Soviet collectivization, are surrounded by rows of birch and pine, planted in lines that run northwest to southeast, blocking the Siberian wind that blows across the plains from November to March. The spacing from the house to the trees is measured in old Belarusian arshins, a unit roughly equivalent to 28 inches. The standard distance, documented in land surveys from the 1800s, is 9 arshins, 21 feet, close enough to 22 that the difference is a rounding error. Now, move to the Netherlands, to Friesland, where farmhouses built on raised mounds to stay above flood level are surrounded by rows of trees called singles. The spacing, measured in Old Dutch voeten, is 12 voeten from the edge of the mound to the tree line. 12 voeten is 22.5 feet, same number, same principle. Different country, different wood, same distance. Move to China, 1,990. The Chinese government launches the 3 North Shelterbelt Project, the largest ecological engineering project in human history, a 4,000-kilometer forest barrier designed to stop desertification and protect agriculture across the northern provinces. The design specifications, published in the 1990 Master Plan and available in the Beijing Forestry Archives, specify tree spacing based on a formula imported from Soviet forestry research, which was itself adapted from European agricultural practices. The distance from structures to the first tree line, 6 to 7 meters, 20 to 23 feet. Same math, same result. The Amish, who came to Pennsylvania from Switzerland and the Rhineland in the 1730s, brought that same tradition with them. They didn't bring Zon's notebook. They didn't need it. They already knew that a house without a windbreak loses heat, that wind strips warmth faster than cold air alone, and that trees planted at the right distance, grown to the right height, angled to block the prevailing wind, make the difference between a house that stays livable and a house that empties your firewood pile by January. They've been planting the same pattern for 287 years. Every Amish farmhouse in Lancaster County, in Holmes County, in every settlement from Pennsylvania to Indiana, has a tree line on the northwest side, planted 20 to 24 feet from the foundation, grown to at least 2.5 times the height of the roof. Here's the number that should make you angry. In 2019, the USDA published an energy efficiency study on residential windbreaks, one of the first comprehensive analyses in over 30 years. They measured heat loss in homes with and without tree windbreaks in cold climates: Minnesota, North Dakota, Wisconsin, Montana. The results were clear. Homes with properly positioned windbreaks, trees planted at 20 to 25 feet from the foundation, grown to mature height, reduced winter heating energy consumption by 43 to 47%. 47%, that's not a minor improvement. That's cutting your heating bill in half. That's the difference between spending $1,200 a winter on heat and spending $640. The study was published in an obscure USDA technical bulletin. It was never press released, never summarized in a homeowner guide, never mentioned in any mainstream home improvement publication. I found it by accident while researching historical forestry programs, and when I read it, I realized I was looking at confirmation of what Raphael Zon had documented in 1934, what the Amish had known since 1737, and what no one had bothered to tell the American public for 40 years. Now let me show you exactly why that happened, because the reason has a name, and the name is money. In 1976, the American Petroleum Institute, the lobbying arm of the oil and gas industry, published an internal report titled Energy Markets and Conservation Behavior. The report, which is publicly available but unindexed and nearly impossible to find unless you know it exists, analyzed the potential impact of widespread residential energy conservation on natural gas demand. One section, page 47, discusses the threat posed by non-mechanical heating efficiency improvements, including windbreaks, earth berming, and passive solar orientation. The conclusion, written in the careful language of industry analysis, states that widespread adoption of these methods could reduce residential heating fuel demand by 30 to 40% within a generation, representing a potential revenue loss of $8 billion annually at 1,976 prices. The report doesn't recommend banning windbreaks. It recommends ensuring that information about windbreaks remains in technical publications rather than consumer-facing media, and that federal extension programs focused on these methods receive reduced funding priority. It's not a conspiracy. It's a business strategy, and it's in writing. That's the kind of thing that doesn't stay buried if enough people know to look for it. So if you don't want this to end up back in an archive where no one can find it, subscribe and turn on notifications. 5 years later, in 1981, the Reagan administration, under pressure to cut federal spending, eliminated funding for the USDA Soil Conservation Service's Shelterbelt programs. The Great Plains Shelterbelt Project, which had been running in some form since 1935, was shut down entirely. Extension agents who had been teaching farmers and homeowners how to plant windbreaks were reassigned or let go. The Windbreak Manual, last updated in 1962, was never reprinted. By 1985, the knowledge had disappeared from mainstream agricultural education, and by 1990, it was gone from architecture schools entirely. The man who fought hardest to keep the program alive was a USDA forestry specialist named Harold Jensen, who testified before a Senate Agriculture Subcommittee in 1982 that cutting the Shelterbelt program would cost American homeowners billions in increased heating costs over the next 20 years. His testimony is in the congressional record. It was ignored. Jensen retired in 1984, and the program died with him. But here's the part that should keep you up at night. The trees Zon's program planted in the 1930s and 40s are still standing. Thousands of miles of shelter belts across North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, planted 80 years ago, still functioning, still cutting wind, still reducing heating costs for the farms and homes they protect. A 2003 study by researchers at South Dakota State University measured energy use in homes with intact shelter belts from the 1930s. The average heating cost reduction, 42%. The trees were planted once, 80 years ago, and they're still saving money, still working, because the physics hasn't changed and the wind hasn't stopped. Now let me show you what the math actually means, because this isn't abstract, this is geometry, and once you see it, you'll understand why 22 feet works and 15 doesn't. Wind doesn't flow like water. Wind doesn't move in straight lines. It shifts through turbulence, eddies, and vertical motion. When it hits a wall or a building, it doesn't stop. It compresses, speeds up, and wraps around the edges, creating high-pressure zones on the windward side and low-pressure vortexes on the leeward side that pull heat out of the structure faster than still air would. That's why a house in open wind loses heat faster than a house in still air at the same temperature. The wind doesn't make the air colder. It makes the air move faster, and moving air strips heat from surfaces through convection. A windbreak doesn't create a solid barrier. It creates a porous one, a wall of branches and trunks that slows the wind without stopping it completely. As wind moves through the trees, it loses velocity, breaking into turbulence and chaotic motion instead of a straight flow. What doesn't pass through is pushed upward, rising and curving over the canopy in a smooth arc before descending on the leeward side. The distance that arc travels before the wind descends back to ground level depends on the height of the trees. The rule, documented in wind engineering studies going back to the 1950s, is that the protected zone extends downwind for a distance of 10 to 15 times the height of the windbreak. If your trees are 20 feet tall, the protected zone extends 200 to 300 feet. If your house sits in that zone, the wind passing over it is 30 to 50 feet in the air, and the air at ground level, the air touching your walls, is nearly still. But the windbreak can't be too close to the house, because if it is, the wind doesn't have room to rise before it hits the roof, and you get turbulence, downdrafts, and pressure zones that actually increase heat loss. The optimal distance, the point where the wind has lifted but the house is still inside the protected zone, is 20 to 25 feet from the foundation. That's not a guess. That's fluid dynamics, tested across thousands of installations over a century. And the trees need to be tall enough to lift the wind over the house instead of into it. A 12-foot roof line means trees at least 30 feet tall, about 2.5 times the height of the structure, creating enough lift to carry airflow above the roof. Shorter trees still help, but they only slow the wind before it reaches the house, reducing the force but not redirecting it. The ideal setup is simple. The wind never touches the building at all. That only happens when the trees are tall enough to push the entire flow upward and over. The Amish understood this not because they studied fluid dynamics, but because they observed what happened when they planted trees closer, farther, taller, shorter, and they kept the configurations that worked. That's empirical knowledge, tested across generations, and it's the same knowledge Raphael Zon formalized in a notebook that's been sitting in a box in Wisconsin for 90 years. Here's what that knowledge costs when you don't have it. The average American household spends $1,200 a year on heating. A home with a properly planted windbreak, 22 feet from the foundation, trees grown to mature height, reduces that cost by 47%. That's $564 saved every year. Over 30 years, the lifespan of the trees, that's $16,920. A windbreak costs about $800 to plant, 7 to 9 trees, decent-sized saplings, mulch, and a weekend of labor. $800 once, or $16,000 lost over 30 years. And that's not counting the carbon sequestration, the wildlife habitat, the increased property value, or the fact that the trees, once established, require zero maintenance and work for a century. 800 versus 16,000. That's not a rounding error. That's a transfer of wealth from your household to the energy companies that profit every time your furnace runs longer than it has to. Now, here's what's still standing, because this isn't just history. In Holmes County, Ohio, there are Amish farmhouses with windbreaks planted in the 1850s, oak and maple lines that are now 60 feet tall. Still standing 22 feet from foundations that have never needed insulation upgrades, because the trees do half the work. In North Dakota, there are shelter belts from Zon's 1930s project, cottonwood and ash, 80 years old, still protecting the farmhouses they were planted to shield. In Belarus, there are birch windbreaks that survived 2 world wars and are still blocking Siberian wind the way they did in 1890. In the Netherlands, there are single lines from the 1600s, pruned and replanted over centuries, still standing at the same distance from the same mounds. All of them, every single one built on the same principle, 22 feet, 2.5 times the height, a northwest angle. It works in Ohio, in North Dakota, in Belarus, in the Netherlands, in China. Climate doesn't matter, species doesn't matter. What matters is the principle, and it stays the same wherever people build for permanence instead of dependence. If your heating bill is over $1,000 a winter, or if you've stood in your house on a cold day and felt the walls radiating cold even though the thermostat says 70, you now know why. It's not because your house is poorly built. It's because the windbreak that's supposed to be there, the 22-foot tree line that every civilization from Belarus to the Amish planted around every structure, isn't there. It was never planted because the program that taught Americans how to do it was shut down in 1981. And the industry that profits from your heating bill made sure it stayed forgotten. 22 feet, 7 to 9 trees, 1 weekend. Plant them this fall, and in 10 years, your heating bill drops by half. The Amish have been doing it for 287 years. Raphael Zon planted 220 million of them. The trees he planted in 1935 are still working. And the only reason you weren't told is because a house that holds heat doesn't need to burn as much gas. And a heating bill that drops by 47% is 47% less revenue for an industry that spent 40 years, making sure you'd never hear that number. If you're the kind of person who thinks knowledge like that deserves to survive, hit the like button. Because every time someone does, this video moves up in the algorithm, and one more homeowner finds out their heating bill doesn't have to be $1,200 a year. Now, here's what I want from you. If you've got trees near your house, and you've never thought about why they're there, go measure the distance, foundation to trunk. If it's 20 to 25 feet, someone who built that house knew what they were doing, and I want to hear about it. Drop a comment. Tell me the distance. Tell me the species. Tell me if your heating bill is lower than your neighbor's. And if you want to make sure you don't miss what's coming next, subscribe and turn on notifications.